Okay. Okay. Everybody have a good lunch? Everybody have a good lunch? Excellent. Excellent. Before we get going here with Craig, I just want to do once again to our sponsors, because I really appreciate what our sponsors do for us. So I want you guys to make sure that you know who they are and that they support our association and events like this. Without them, it would be much more difficult to do these events. So again, Sherwin-Williams, Pella, PHBI, Elton, Novatech, Guardian Glass, JSA Machinery, Screenco, Tremco, FCI, Mr. Petco, Federated Insurance, Caldwell Interlock, ESS, Open Janela, Quanex, Amesbury Truth, Plaspro, Ultrafab, Pref ERP, ODL, Trimlight, Leighton Consulting, Lux, 50 years, Lux, DeKunick, Marvin, PH Tech, Furco, Fenestration Review, and New Coat. So thank you to them. We really appreciate their support. Yes, indeed. Yeah, give them a round for sure. Okay, so our next session, I'd like to welcome Craig Drumheller. He is WDMA's Vice President of Technical Activities. In his role, he's responsible for managing all of WDMA's technical codes and standards activities. Prior to coming to WDMA, Craig was the Assistant VP for Construction Codes and Standards at the National Association of Home Builders. In his role, he oversaw NAHB's Codes and Standards Advocacy, and prior to that, Craig was a Senior Energy Engineer at NAHB Research Center for 13 years, where he performed field and modeling research for various government departments and private industries. He was also NAHB's lead engineer codes expert for 15 years. There's a worldwide push to increase energy performance in buildings. The U.S. is also making dramatic changes in both energy codes and Energy Star to reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions. This session will provide updates on the latest and upcoming requirements for residential buildings while focusing on fenestration. So welcome, Craig Drumheller. Let me get his session going here. You should be good to go.
Great. Thank you, Terry. So again, my name is Craig Drumheller. I've been involved in the development of energy codes and standards for a while. I'm on the ASHRAE 90.1 committee. I've been there in wearing different hats for the last 15 or so years, and I'm also heavily involved in the development of the IECC, the energy code for the residential side, and been heavily involved in that for probably since, I don't know, 2005 or so. Which way? Up? Down? Where do I point it? There's lights on. There we go. Okay. All right. So, as most of you know, there's energy code goals out there from a variety of entities. The International Code Council, who develops the IECC, has a goal to achieve net zero energy by 2030. AIA, the American Institute of Architects, had a goal way back in 2005 or 6 to have net zero energy by 2030. That's evolved over time to carbon neutrality, because that's the new buzzword. Energy isn't enough anymore. And in 2008, the California Public Utility Commission developed a plan for all new residential homes to be net zero by 2020. Well, that didn't happen, but these are what they refer, when they get them, they're goals. When they don't get them, they're aspirational goals, but they're going to keep coming back for these. And then, of course, you know better than I on this, that Canada has a net zero emissions goal of by 2050 for the entire economy, and emission reductions of 40 to 45% by 2030. So there's a lot of very aggressive goals out there, and trying to do the right thing. But how do we do that by still getting people into houses, still have comfortable homes and buildings, and have them cost effective to the point that they can still be constructed? So that was kind of the hat that I wore when I was at NHB, and I think everybody kind of falls into that category of we want things to be as efficient as they can, but we can't disrupt the economy too much by trying to achieve these goals. And one question that I did want to ask everybody, so I can get a feel, I'm coming from Washington, D.C., and not particularly fully familiar with the FENCAN membership. So how many people here are primarily Canadian businesses that do some business in the United States? And Okay, thank you. And how many are primarily U.S. companies that do business in Canada? Okay, no, it's good to know. Give me some perspective, but it looks like the majority of you Canadian companies also do business in the United States. So this isn't necessarily what's just coming, but this is something that's going to affect you directly. So the U.S. National Energy Code. So technically, the United States does not have a national energy code, but they have two that are well recognized in federal statutes. One is ASHRAE 90.1, and I see ASHRAE 90.1 is actually being used to some extent here in Canada. And like I said, I've been on that committee since the mid-2000, 2010, right around there, and heavily involved in that development. And they've been pushing, they've got their goals as well, but they have a cost effectiveness requirement to try to increase the efficiency, but in a cost effective manner. Also, there's the IECC residential, and that covers single family, detached, single family, attached, and multifamily up to 3 stories. And I think that's consistent with your chapter 9. Is that part 9? Part 9. And so whenever I refer to residential energy codes, it's consistent with that. And so the high-rise residential would fall into the commercial classification in the United States. So once the codes are published, the Department of Energy does a determination to find out whether the new code is more efficient than the previous code. And once they've done that determination, a variety of things kick into place where states, they have to go through a process, at least the statute says they have to do that. There's no teeth to it, right? There's no teeth to do it, but they have to go through a process of having public reviews that make sure that everybody has an opportunity to comment on the adoption of the latest code. And on the residential side, they don't have to do it. On the commercial side, they have to do it, but whether they do it or they don't do it, again, no teeth. Initially there was a big bucket of money back in 2009 with the ERA funding when the economy started to go down. But since then, nobody's put any new money in there. So if you don't comply, then you don't. It doesn't impact your state or your jurisdiction. So here is the Department of Energy puts together what they call a progress indicator. They hire PNNL, which is up in the Pacific Northwest National Labs, which many of you might be familiar with. But this is a chart that they keep adding on to, and I think it's a good indicator of how things have moved along through the years. You can see that there was some concerted effort along the way in the early 2000s, and then around 2010, there were big increases in energy efficiency, and things since then have flattened out quite a bit. But now that we have a new process that's going on, I think there's a concerted effort to do a more coordinated, targeted effort to find out exactly where the efficiency can be found cost effectively, and then applying that. So here you can see that the expectation is for the 2024, which will be the next edition of the residential IECC, we'll see roughly a 6% increase in performance. So the International Code Council has their primary process by which they develop codes, and this is the new version, but at the end of the day, it's very similar to what they had done previously. So there's hearings, you submit proposals, there's hearings, you submit, so half of the code groups are separated for the first year. The second half of the code groups are for the second year. They have a variety of hearings, but what they're doing, with what they had done before, ultimately there's a public comment hearing, and this is heard by the voting officials, the governmental officials, who are primarily code officials. They're also there's a big representation from the fire marshals and that side of the aisle. But what happened about 10 years ago is they added this online governmental consensus vote. So the people that weren't necessarily as active in the process now still had the ability to be eligible voters. And when it came to energy, there were a lot of groups that were very concerned about, hey, how do we get become more energy efficient? And these were not people that are well versed in walking through houses and how houses go together, the costs, and so at the end of the day, there was a problem with unusual voting in the United States, and this preceded what happened maybe other time. I'm not passing any judgment. I'm just saying that that there was unusual voting here, and the International Code Council recognized that, and so they changed their process for energy, and only for energy, to go from their governmental consensus process to a committee process. And what they did was this allowed them to control who the voting body is, and they wanted to make sure that a third of them were code officials, and code officials that they kind of handpicked. And I think of the 48 people, 16 were code officials, 10 were builders, a few people from energy efficiency groups, and maybe about half a dozen manufacturers, of which I'm one of the manufacturers that's on the committee. But along with changing the process, they kind of had some rules that they wanted to, this framework that they put together, and they wanted to make sure that it was going to be done right. They wanted to make sure that it was cost effective. They wanted to make sure that it reached net zero, at least had the ability to reach net zero. I'll talk about that later. But then also had the greenhouse gas reductions. It had a lot of other features in it. So they were kind of, from the board level, they're saying, all right, you can do it, but we want to give you some more construct than you ever had before, that a committee can do much better than the previous governmental consensus process that they had. So the new standards development process, we're in process right now. You can see the red dot. That's where we are today. But we've come down. They've selected the committee, proposed changes. The committee and subcommittees reviewed it. They made changes. It went out for a first draft, and now we're in the process of making subsequent changes to it. So we're right here on the second lap, and probably going to have to go around one, maybe two more laps before no more changes are being made. And once there's no more changes being made, it'll finally go to publication. And even though it's taken about 1.5 years to get where we're at, I think they're going to do the next 2 laps pretty quickly, and we're going to have it published I'm hoping by the end of the year that this will all be done and ready to go. But at this point, 95, 98, 99% of the changes I think have been made. It's just a matter of, even if you make one change, right, in the standards process, you gotta go back and do it all over again. So now I'm going to talk about some of the specific changes, and for those of you who are not familiar with the climate zones in the United States, here we've got climate zone 0 does not exist in the United States. That's like very hot, very dry, like sub-Saharan desert type locations. But climate zone 1 is Miami and Brownsville, Texas. Climate zone 2 is pretty much the Gulf region. Climate zone 3 through here, everything's fine until you hit the Rockies. And this used to be a very simple chart, and then it got complicated when they added some other things. So that's climate zone 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's more 7 in Alaska, and 8. So just to give you some perspective, that maybe Toronto would probably be climate zone 5, and Montreal in 6, and I'm not sure where Vancouver would fall into that, but here we have the SI units for those of you who speak SI. So our changes are primarily climate zone based, and I'll start off with fenestration because that's what we're doing here. So we changed it from vertical fenestration, from fenestration to vertical fenestration, to kind of segregate out skylights a little bit more cleaner than it was done before. But for the most part, the changes that we're making are really only in the colder climate zones. Other than skylights, they made some changes too, but kind of incremental changes, right? 6, 7 to 10% improvement in the northern climate zones. But for the most part, not many changes were made. Fairly consistent with Energy Star version 6, which kind of works out well. I mean, that's what the intention of Energy Star is, to kind of stay one step ahead of the building codes, and almost at the same time that kicks in, the new version of Energy Star that will be going to publication here. So that works out fairly well. And here, just to kind of give you a perspective over time on how the fenestration requirements have evolved, and you can see that there were some big steps early on in the South, going from single pane to double pane, but since then it's been pretty flat. There's not a lot of heat transfer, right, in climate zone 1 in Miami. It doesn't get really hot and it doesn't get really cold, and the windows aren't as significant from the U factor perspective. Now, right, you got your solar heat gain, and to achieve the solar heat gain that's required, you almost functionally have to get to a double pane window. But in the northern climate zones, you can see that there's some tweaks in the last couple rounds, but not any major steps, because we're kind of hitting the wall with the current technology that's being mass produced. With Skylights, fairly similar, but a big step this go around. And here's other changes to be expected in 2024. Air leakage, I think that's kind of a big deal for the fenestration people. And there's me back in my younger days when I did blower door tests for research purposes. So the air changes are going from 5 to 4 in the southern climate zones. Not that difficult to get to 4 air changes per hour, so even though there's not a lot of energy savings to it, probably a good thing to do for a variety of reasons. The middle climate zones are still staying at 3, but once you get up into climate zones 6, 7, and 8, it's making an incremental step from 3 to 2.5 air changes per hour. And multifamily dwellings are obviously a little bit more complicated on how you do it. Do you do it a floor at a time? Do you do it for the entire building? And primarily in the United States, they're doing it 1 unit at a time, and so they wanted to have a different metric for that based on the shape of it. And so here we're going to have a drop from 0.3 to 0.27. And for those of you who don't speak CFM per square foot, a multiplier of 5 to get to the metric units. And then this was a very controversial issue to do sampling protocol for buildings with more than 8 units. Once you figure out how to do it, to me, and a lot of data showed it out, that once you figure out how to seal a building, you're going to continue to do it. They're not going to selectively say, hey, we're going to seal these up real good and leave the rest real leaky. So they added that, but again, there's a lot of people that were against that. So other changes to expect: energy recovery ventilation. These are non-fenestration related. Energy recovery ventilation in climate zone 6 already was required in 7 and 8. Electric readiness for gas water heaters and stoves and ovens. This is part of the decarbonization that's coming along. It said you basically got to wire, even though you put in a gas water heater or you put in a gas stove, someday in the future they may want to put an electric stove or an electric water heater in there. Therefore, you need to pre-wire it for that. And you can imagine the gas industry wasn't super thrilled about that. But that got in. Solar ready zones. So on your roof, if you're oriented in such a way, you have to, I think it's 500 square feet, so 50 square meters. Then you have to have a conduit. You have to have capacity in the panel. So that was something that was optional before. Now it's going to be a requirement for 2024. Demand response electric water heating, which I think is an interesting thing to try to put in the energy code now, but now that's going to be in there. So basically, you have to buy a water heater. You don't have to hook it up to the utility, right? You don't have to connect with the utility, but you have to buy a water heater that is capable of electric response. So when they're in a high demand period, they can basically shut off your water heater for certain periods of time. Electric vehicles are now, and these are things that, in my opinion, shouldn't be in an energy code, but they found their way to get into the energy codes. Electric vehicle ready requirements, and so that varies from anywhere from having an actual, to plug into the car, or have a conduit to it, or actually have it wired and then blocked off right at the location. So every single family home is going to have it wired and to a receptacle. The multifamily, 40% of parking spaces have to have some level of electric vehicle readiness. So these are some of the things in the United States that are coming down the pike. Now, what we do in our codes, we have what we call adoptable appendices. So if when you adopt a code, you don't explicitly say, I want to adopt Appendix RC because I want zero net energy ready buildings, then it doesn't apply. It's still in the book, right? It's still in the code, but it's not adopted if it's not explicitly adopted. So they have zero net energy buildings, and so that's kind of the way that they're complying with the requirements of the IECC framework. Electric energy storage provisions. So if you're going to have, some places could potentially say, look, I'm going to have photovoltaics, and to get some credits, I want to have storage capabilities. So then you might want to adopt this appendix to have that in place. All electric residential buildings. So rather than just wiring it to gas, you're not going to put the gas anymore. You're going to have electric, have an all electric house, and so this has the capability of adopting it, and then there would be some continuity at least across states if they adopted it to these appendices. On-site renewable energy. So there was a lot of debate, as you can imagine, whether that was going to be in the body of the code or an appendix. At the last minute, it got pulled out and ended up as an appendices. So if a jurisdiction or a state wants to adopt that requirement, it's there in writing, in mandatory language that can be adopted. So now, so here's zero. So the code is getting more and more stringent, and then here's all the way to zero, and then somebody wants to split the difference and say, okay, well, we're going to have a stretch code, so it's going to be somewhere in between the mandatory minimum and net zero. So they're going to have all flavors in there, and they added an additional appendix. In 2018 or 2021 before that, 2015, there were no appendices. Now we're already to RP. So once that gate opened up, they figured they could put a lot of appendices in it, of which I don't think very many are getting adopted. And then operational carbon rating, energy reporting. So it's really just a matter of reporting to the code official and reporting to the home buyer what the carbon rate is. But it was controversial enough that it got pulled out of the main body and put into appendices. So adoption in the United States is a little bit more haphazard. Well, I was somewhat relieved to see that Canada kind of has some code adoption and energy. It's not as smooth as I had initially expected. But here you can see in the orange and lighter and darker oranges, these are code equivalencies to the Pacific Northwest National Labs and the U.S. Department of Energy, that these are 2009 and previous equivalent performance levels. So there's a portion of the United States that's a decade or more behind what the current or latest published codes are. And as you would expect, you have Washington, California, the only non-IECC based, right? A lot of them adopt the codes and then make modifications, but California doesn't. They want to do it their own way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But California, this is equivalent performance. So you can see there's a few states that are green states, and then the lighter green are a little bit farther behind, and in white are the 8 states in the United States that don't have state codes, so they adopt at the local level. You can imagine is kind of a nightmare to have city by city and county by county adopting their own energy codes and deciding what they're going to do. So to kind of encourage states to move along, they've got a lot of incentives, and just last year there were some big incentives that were dropped, amounting to over $1.2 billion of incentive get states to adopt either the latest code or improve their codes, or the bulk of the money actually went to net zero provisions to be adopted at the state and local level. So they're really pushing for that. It's going to be interesting because they haven't even, I think they just recently opened up for people to apply for this money. It'll be interesting to see who gets the money, what they're proposing to do to get the money. Does that work? Okay. So there's a lot of money for a lot of incentives, and it's going to be interesting to see what states bite on the money. I would guess that this is going to be a lot more sought after because it doesn't have as many restrictions on it. This is basically, if you are one of these states back here that are way behind the times, you don't have to go all the way up to the latest codes to get that money. You just have to do better than you were doing before. But this money is the latest published code. So wherever you are, you gotta jump all the way up to the latest published codes to be able to be eligible for any of that money. And then the net zero is going to be interesting. I just can't imagine any state adopting that wholesale as a requirement for new construction. But we'll see how that plays out in the next year. So Energy Star. Energy Star, I know you're familiar with Energy Star here in Canada. In 1997, windows, doors, and skylights were added to the requirements, or to the eligible products for Energy Star. I think there's around 80 products that are total covered under the Energy Star label. Version 6 is what we are currently on today. That was adopted in 2015. Now version 7 has basically been finalized. It was finalized last October with a implementation date of October 23rd of this year. So there's going to be some pretty big jumps in the Energy Star requirements, and then there will also be new reporting requirements. And in the United States, FGIA and WDMA have kind of partnered together to gather some of the shipment data and report it to EPA rather than going through their portal. Historically, there hasn't been a lot of people reporting their shipment data, and now they're going to crack down on it and enforce it. At least they claim they're going to enforce it starting next year. So here, this is, I don't expect you to read this, but the big takeaway here, without solar heat gain trade-offs, a big jump from the 0.27 down to 0.22. Do your math, your 5, 6, 7, 8 divisor or multiplier to get to those numbers. I know that's closer to some of the code stuff that was being talked about this morning, but this is what's going to be the Energy Star version 7 requirements. But there are, however, for those of you who are not quite as familiar, there are solar heat in the northern climate zones. There are solar heat gain trade-offs for U factor to solar heat gain that encourages the high solar heat gain. And we talked to, or people were talking this morning about how problematic that can be. But this is Energy Star, and they're kind of encouraging that, basically saying we want a high solar. We'll give away a U factor for high solar heat gain coefficient. So we'll see how that plays out. But that's the way it's going for the next version. And the windows in the north central is probably the one. There is no trade-off in the north central zone. So that's the yellow zone here. So there you can't trade off. So you can potentially have a worse U factor here than here. But that's the way it came out. We were trying to get that to 0.26, but they didn't go for that. So glazed doors, a fairly big jump from 0.3 down to 0.26. Skylights had some bigger improvements, and you saw that on the chart. And a 10 to 20, the climate zones. Before it was heating degree days and very, very loose lines. And what they're doing is they're going similar to the energy code, where they define by county what climate zone they're in. So at least it's a little bit more clear as to what, when you're installing it, whether or not you're compliant with the proper zone or not. And now they've got a Energy Star, and I'm not sure if up here they have Energy Star Most Efficient, but the Energy Star Most Efficient, they refer to as the best of the best. I didn't make that up. That's from their website. And it's extension of the existing brand. And interesting that you cannot label, they will not let you label it Most Efficient. You can have some logos around the Most Efficient stuff, but you can't label it as Most Efficient. And this is something that they update rather than every 6, 8, 10 years. They're updating it every year. And they've got only 12, rather than the 80 some product lines, they've only got 12 product lines that fall into that they've decided to classify some as most efficient. They know it's not cost effective, but they want to target the more environmentally conscious consumers, early adopters, people that are willing to go that extra mile so they can tell their friends, hey, I've got these better windows, I've got these better doors, I've got this better widget that's got a most efficient criteria associated with it. It does not include entry doors. So entry doors, the highest criteria that they have is just the regular Energy Star, and they just last month added Skylights. And they added Skylights because there's new federal tax incentives that they said, oh, well, for most efficient Skylights, we're going to give money, and there's not a most efficient program for Skylights. So they went ahead and threw together a most efficient criteria for Skylights. And here's the most efficient that we have for windows and Skylights. The U factor is 0.2 throughout the entire country is 0.2, and the solar heat gain varies from north to south, where in the south they want it to be less than 0.25, in the north it can't be less than 0.2. So there's at least an area in there where a specific window will qualify for the entire country, right? If you're between the 0.25 and 0.40, you comply everywhere in the country. I'm sorry. If you're below 0.25, you qualify everywhere in the country. And then the Skylights, they combined a bunch of the zones, the north central, south central, and southern into one. And then for the northern, they allowed any solar heat gain coefficient and a little bit more stringent on the U factor. But this is new stuff that just came out last month. And then, like I said, it was tied to the tax credits. The tax credits, yeah. So the National Association of Home Builders does surveys every year on what home buyers really want. And for energy efficiency, Windows has been #1 for a long time, a decade, maybe even more. Now, is that going to hold true with version 7, right? Six major changes weren't really necessary to get to 6, but to get to 7, there's a potential for major changes to be made. So is that, if the costs go up, significantly, is there going to be a loss of interest? I don't know, but surveys, like I said, have consistently from the home buyers, Energy Star windows. And now are the tax credits going to make a difference on that? Well, first of all, the tax credits for windows have to be most efficient. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out. But all I can really say is that over the last decade, that has been not only #1, it's #1 by a lot. And so consumers are asking for it.
So today, the most U.S. residential PVC window manufacturers
I think I saw over 70 manufacturers. They have 70 partners, right? Energy Star partners for Windows, and so there's a lot of them out there. And I would guess they're doing it for a reason. So the 25C tax credits, they renewed it. 25C tax credits have been this it's in, it's out, it's in, it's out. They let it expire. They make it retroactive. They've been doing that for at least 15 years. And now when they did it the last time, they said, all right, we're going to do it for 10 years. And I think there's a lot of relief on that. It's like, okay, good. But now at least we know what we're in for, as opposed to the on again, off again 25C tax credit eligibility. And it applies to heating and cooling systems, water heating, insulation, renewable energy, solar, and of course windows, doors, and skylights. So the windows and skylights fall into the most efficient category, right? So it's not a huge amount of money, and it'll be interesting to see if people are attracted by this. But to go to a 0.2 window and get a maximum of $600, we'll see if there's value to that. I would personally guess that skylights are going to be a little bit more attractive, right? I'm going to put in one skylight. It cost me, I'm making up a number, $1,800. I can get the full $600 for one. But if I'm going to buy 30 windows that are 0.2 and it's a $600 difference, that's not going to be my driver to go to more efficient. At least I wouldn't expect. Exterior doors, which includes sliding and swinging doors, so patio doors would fall into that category. This is only at the Energy Star level, so Energy Star 6 up until October, and then Energy Star 7 after that. 30% of the project cost again, but maximizing out at $500 rather than $600 at the Energy Star level, not the most efficient level. So I would expect some interest in that as well. So now moving on to California. Yes, you want me to go back?
Now they're, just to clarify, those tax credits
Are annual,
are
right?
now annual. So that same person who put that one skylight in December could go back and get
Another
a credit
one in January.
In January and put the second one in. And then you can do that really for 8 straight years. That's
Right.
the way the law has been written.
Right.
So there could be, because of that, there could be some interest. And the other thing you didn't mention either is that I think it's our hope that we can convince the EPA to consider a tiered U factor requirement for the windows program.
For the next, right,
Windows
for
and doors.
2024.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So California Title 24, that's kind of always, at least in the United States, looked at as the kind of the leading edge or the bleeding edge of energy efficiency. They're halfway through, but really just beginning the public aspect of it. So we've been involved a little bit in the utility. So this green bar is where the utilities, the California utilities, which they're the main drivers of the change to the California Title 24, and then the light blue is the public input. And at this point, they had made some with publication somewhere in towards the middle or end of 2024. So California wanted to. They made an initial recommendation. This is the case. The utilities made the initial recommendations of 0.25 U factor for 2 California zones, right? Here's zone 1 along the coast, and zone 16, which kind of circles around back and actually comes all the way down to here. And they wanted those to be 0.25 and then the rest of the state to be 0.28. And so we weren't particularly happy with that, so we commented on that. And then also, what we thought was a much bigger deal was minimum solar heat gain coefficients. And when you really look at this, it's especially based on conversations that went on earlier this morning, minimum solar heat gain of 0.35 in 4 Northern California zones. So this would be 16, and I kind of exaggerate a little bit when I say northern, because it was 16, 1, 3, and 5. So it really was these coastal zones right here. So they're basically saying, we don't want low solar. We want, it has to be 0.35 or higher. And we had about 15 reasons why that was a bad idea. and they reconsidered it. So after the first public comment period, they reconsidered. Right now, they're looking at 0.28 U factor for the entire the entire state, and went back to the solar heat gain. There's no requirement in those climate zones rather than having a minimum requirement. So every once in a while you make your comments and you feel like they listened, and in this case we felt like they listened. So and I guess the takeaway from that is that they really weren't pushing windows that far in California. So I think they're at this point, I think they're at they feel that they're at a reasonable maximum. At least that's my interpretation of the requests that they've made or their proposed changes. So I think that's all I have.
Questions for Craig? Craig needed an hour, but I converted it to metric, and we only got 45 minutes for him. So I've only got a couple of minutes if anybody has a question
It was
for
the
him.
exchange rate.
Thank you. I just wonder, how long you been doing it? The energy efficiency for windows and doors in the USA. When you started it?
When did the first energy code land? Well, going back to the history, let's see if I can get back there. That was late 70s, right? Whoop. For Energy Star?
Oh,
So
later, later.
So energy codes were the late 70s, right? So that was consistent with the oil embargo and all that. It was 70.
Fenestration at that time when they came in, there was limits put on fenestration or metrics. Or no?
They didn't have limits at first. They didn't know how to apply. I think they were using U factors for entire buildings, and no, it was a wild west back then.
What I'm saying is, wouldn't you in California make one window which covers whole California? Why do you have to all these little areas?
No.
Every town has their own energy efficient stuff.
No, right. They have 16 climate zones, right? So, and that's what we're pushing. We wanted to have one requirement for solar heat gain and one requirement for the U factor.
It's kind of like Canada's Energy Star has one zone. Entire country.
You were saying that there's no teeth in the system to force the states to adopt any of this, because I guess it falls under state jurisdiction rather than federal. So is it only like the more blue states who tend to adopt this and red states tend to not?
Well, I'll let you draw your own conclusion. I didn't do an overlay with the results of the last election, but
Yeah. Well, there's you heard about this diagonal country that people are talking about? It's kind of a joke. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alaska down through Alberta and the prairie provinces.
All right. Anything else? All right. Thanks very much,
great.
Craig.
All right,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you. Appreciate your time.